Hello, and welcome to the second day of the online seminar on drug policies and development, conflict or coexistence. This event is co-organized by the Policy Center for the New South and the International Development Policy Journal at the Graduate Institute Geneva. The objective of the event is to discuss, together with some of the authors, some of the chapters of the new issue of international development policy, which focuses on the linkages between drug policy and the international development goals. And this issue was produced in partnership with the Global Commission on Drug Policy. So yesterday, we looked at drug policy and their link with security and peace building. And today we will focus on the nexus between childhood, gender, and drug policy. I'm Ugo Panizza. I'm a professor of economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and I'm also the editor-in-chief of International Development Policy. And today I'm very happy that we have three authors of this special issue. Corina Giacomello, who will focus on the gender impact of drug policy on women, with a special focus on Mexico. Damon Barrett, who will focus on child rights in global drug policy. And Richard Chelin, who will focus on the evolution of drug policies and its impact on gender and development, with a focus on Mauritius. Each author will talk for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have half an hour of question and answers. Please send your questions through social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you're using. At the end, we'll conclude with some remarks by Abdelek Bassou, who is from the Policy Center for the New South, and Khalid Tinasti, who is one of the editors of this special issue and is the director of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. So just a couple of words about the three authors that we have today. Corina Giacomello is a researcher at the University of Chiapas in Mexico. She has been there since 2007, and she works on the intersection of gender, drug, and incarceration with a special focus on women working in female prisons. And she has worked as a consultant for many international organizations and non-governmental and NGOs. Damon Barrett is an associate senior lecturer at the School of Public Health and Community Medicine at the University of Gothenburg, and is the co-director of the International Center on Human Rights. And he has recently published a book on child rights and drug control in international law. Richard Chelin is a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. He has been working since 2018 on a project on organized crime in Pretoria. Before he was a researcher in transitional justice, in the Transitional Justice Program at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in Johannesburg. So with this brief introduction, I'm gonna give the word to Corina. Corina will speak for about 15 minutes. I'll tell you when you have 1 minute left. Please go ahead, Corina.
Thank you, Hugo, and well, good morning to everybody from Mexico. Damon, Richard, it's an honor to share the panel with you. Thank you for the invitation to join you in this event. So my participation will focus on the chapter I wrote for the special issue, which is on the gender impacts of drug policy on women. As Hugo said, my main area of research is Mexico, which is where I work and live. And although at the same time, some of the findings that have been done during the research are comparable to what we find in other latitudes. So when we talk about the gender impacts of drug policy on women, we can look at different groups of women. We have women in prison, women who use drugs, and women who look after people in prison and people who use drugs. In this case, I focus on women in prison in Mexico and women who are detained in compulsory drug treatment centers, which is a reality in Mexico and Latin America, as well as in other countries. Detention is seen as a physical place, of course, because women are actually incarcerated or detained in compulsory drug treatment centers against their will, but also as a symbolic space where the effects of drug policy, particularly the criminalization of drug offenses and the criminalization and stigmatization of drug users, cross with gender beliefs and particularly with the discrimination and violence against women. So I've been doing research in Mexican prisons for about 15 years. And in 2019, I did a research on women in compulsory drug treatment centers, women and adolescent girls as well. What do we see in regards to these two groups? When we look at women in prison for drug offenses, we see that there has been a staggering increase in this population. So even if women represent still about the 6% of the prison population worldwide, drug policies have been the main driver for the increase of this population, which has gone up of about 50% between 2000 and 2018, against an increase of the male prison population of about 20%. So drug offenses are the first or second cause of women incarceration, especially in Southeast Asia and Latin America. What kind of women are we talking about, though? Well, mainly what we find when we cross prison doors is poor women who are the primary or sole caregivers of their children, and who have become involved either through family or male friends or mainly partners. So the whole romantic love issue of gender is quite dominant in their life stories, and also trying to fulfill the role of the good wife and the good mother. Mainly, they are responsible for non-violent drug offenses, either minor drug offenses, such as sale or basically dealing, or for international transportation, what we usually refer to as human couriers or drug mules as well. So basically, they have caring responsibilities, non-violent precedents, and mainly commit non-violent offenses. Nevertheless, they are often pre-trial detention and long prison sentences, because that's a consequence of the international framework of drug control. So because of the international dimension of the offenses they commit or are accused of committing, they usually spend long times in prisons. It is not the purpose of this intervention or my paper to go into female prison conditions, but still it's important to remember that 10 years ago, the Bangkok rules on women in prison were approved, but we're still far away from actually seeing them implemented. So although prisons are hostile and not friendly environments for nobody, still the conditions for women tend to be worse in terms of not having enough female prison centers, and so women are put away from their homes, or being put, and that's the case in Mexico, in prisons where you have men and women in separate buildings, but still where the scarcer services that are actually available are mainly available for men. So we have a criminalization for drug offenses, which again leads to mandatory pre-trial detention, long sentences, lack of access to alternatives to incarceration as a consequence of the drug control system, and then a whole invisibilization and further discrimination in the prison system. The impacts, as we all can imagine, are multiple. First of all, we have to remember where these women come from, which is, again, poverty, underdevelopment, and usually places where dominant gender beliefs are still in place. So these women mainly share a history of gender-based violence that is present throughout their lives, and that's never taken care of by the state, but it's actually reproduced and reinforced by the prison system and the crossing with drug policies. We have multiple stories we could share. We'll share briefly just one, and then we'll move to the next section, which is about women who use drugs. That's the story of Gabi. Gabi is an indigenous woman from the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. She was involved in what the International Labour Organization would define as one of the worst forms of child labor, which is drug trafficking, when she was only 12. She was trying to make money for her family, since after her father migrated to the United States, he stopped sending money home. So she started dealing, basically carrying drug packages of marijuana, basically, which is what they cultivate in Oaxaca, to Mexico City. Then at the age of 15, she was raped, and that's where her first daughter came from. And then later on, she became involved with a local drug trafficker, and she continued carrying marijuana throughout from Oaxaca to Mexico City. She got pregnant with her second child, and he was born with brain paralysis. Of course, she had no money to pay for healthcare, for health studies, for nothing. The man disappeared. There was no father there, so she gave her child the cures that were available in the community, which is basically teas and and rituals. And so her son grew up and she continued being involved in drug carrying in order to try to get the money to actually provide for his healthcare. When she was caught, that's the first time that she became of interest to the state. When she was involved in drug trafficking at the age of 12, there was no state to protect her. When she was raped, there was no state to repair or try to at least punish that offense. And when she became pregnant and her child had a severe health problem, again, there was no public health system, absolutely no social program, nothing to help her look after her child and provide for herself. But when she trafficked marijuana and about a few kilos, then the state was very present and sent her to prison for 10 years. And she was in prison with her son until the judge said to her, well, the crime is one thing, your child is another thing, and your child has to go out of prison because the legal term for his staying with you is over. And that's one of the things that should be challenged. That's, of course, another area which has to do with children's rights, and that's what Damon will talk about. But it's this idea that children are not affected by parental incarceration, and that it's only an issue of the people who are actually in prison. So as we can see, the impacts are, of course, not only for the person who is in prison, but also for the surrounding. When Gabby got out, well, of course, she was highly stigmatized for having been in prison. So she had to move from her village to another one because she was a single mother and she had been incarcerated. And she's now struggling in order to make money for herself and her children. She worked as a cleaning lady in a house, but during COVID, she lost her job. So that's part of the impacts of drug policy on poor women from contexts of violence that begin in childhood and go on cyclically throughout their lives and are reinforced and reproduced by state interventions. In the case of women who use drugs, we find similar trends in terms of stigmatization and criminalization, and also in terms of patterns. The use of drugs by women has been increasing. We still see gender differences between men and women, although they tended to even during adolescence. And there's an inverted gender gap where we look at controlled substances, with women doing more use of controlled substances than men, at least with the data we have available, based on the data we have available. We also see that women find again further barriers to access treatment when they actually want to seek it. And these barriers are cultural, are social, and are structural as well. There actually are less treatment centers able to receive women and to treat them with a gender perspective and to actually take into account their caregiving responsibilities. There are few little centers that will actually have spaces for women where they can leave their children when they are undergoing their therapy or the treatment, in case they want to take them with them, of course. There are little centers that will have flexibility for women to show up when they can, based on their multiple tasks, and again, because they are primary or sole caregivers of their children. So we have a lack of services for women. The women that I interviewed were mainly in prison or in compulsory drug treatment centers. And again, the story is basically the same. Sexual violence in childhood, and then throughout their lives, one partner after the other, one relative after the other. And violence being reproduced in institutional settings, prisons, as we already said, but also drug treatment centers, police stations, and the general framework of drug policy crossing with gender beliefs. So if you're a drug user, you are quite likely not to be seen very sympathetically, although of course it's changing and it depends on each country and context. But if you're a woman who uses drugs, you are completely breaking with all the paradigms that are acceptable in your case. So of course the stigma is much higher in the family, in the relationship, in the treatment settings. Although again, we must look at particular settings and contexts. But I do find higher barriers to have access to treatment. And then the other topic, that is compulsory drug treatment center, that's of course not present in all countries. We know it's mainly a reality, again, in Latin and Central America, in the Caribbean, and in Southeast Asia. It's quite worrying how little is still said about these centers. There was a fantastic joint declaration in 2012, but during COVID, really there was very little in comparison to what we heard about prisons, for example. for adults and incarcerated adolescents. So it is still a humanitarian emergency. We have thousands of people being locked up against their will in places which are mainly religious driven or sometimes under the control of organized crime, that are completely out of state control, and where there's no treatment, there's just praying and beating and humiliation, and people not being allowed to live. Again, when we cross this with gender, the situation we find is even more terrible, because women are more prone to being sexually assaulted, to being victims of harassment and sexual violence, not only by the people who run the drug treatment centers, but also by their fellow partners who are detained with them. And again, they will not find any sort of support or actual treatment in the centers. Another very worrying point of exclusion for women who use drugs is all the services which are actually available for women victims of violence. So on the one hand, we have few women-only drug treatment centers, and I would say that's a reality even in the European context. Of course, you will have more than you have in Mexico, where you have none. But again, in some countries, the offer is very limited. Or you can have women-only centers, but that will not take their children in. So that's an issue when you have no one to leave them with. So that's on the side of drug policy or drug treatment interventions. But then on the side of services for women who are victims of violence, what we found that is that usually, and I could confirm it in Mexico for another study on violence against women and children, is that shelters or institutions that provide services, being legal, psychological, or again, or shelter because of the high risk they face, will not accept women who use drugs. Well, they might accept them formally, but usually they are excluded, again, either legally or simply de facto. Why? Because these places do not have the personnel, the expertise, the knowledge to treat both things at the same time, violence against women and drug use or drug dependence. So there are some women who simply do not fit in, who have no space, who are no people, who do not have a provision of services and help and compassion and empowerment. Because of their drug use. We find that in prison, we find that in drug treatment centers. So this is basically what my paper looks into. It's based on, again, years of research as an academic, as an activist. Most of the stories, or all the story, are from Mexico. But again, there are many parallelisms with situations worldwide when we look at the intersection of gender and drug policy. It has been taken note of this at the international level, of course. There are resolutions. The topic is included in the UNGAS declaration. We have a specific resolution on gender mainstreaming in drug policies from 2006, CND. However, even if drug policies, of course, do not cause violence against women, we could take drug policy away and violence will still be there. But they are part of the patriarchal structures that help reproduce it and create institutional and symbolic and narrative settings for, again, the reproduction and the persistence of violence against women. So to have adjustments such as alternatives to incarceration, better data gathering, women-only centers, it's completely important that these are policy interventions that are needed and are urgent. We need to release women from prison. We need for women to have no barriers to access treatment. We need for women to be able to find spaces where they can be protected if they're victims of violence and they use drugs. We need all of that. And we need to work towards it at the international, national, and local level. But also, while the main framework of drug policy remains untouched, and while the main punitive, stigmatizing approach remains the leading one, and while there is not enough interagency cooperation with UN Women, UNICEF, and all those who need to be there, and of course, while we don't have a full decriminalization, all these realities will keep perpetuating themselves because they are entrenched in the patriarchal order of relationships. Well, thank you for your attention. And I think I was getting my timing excellent for that.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Corina. So I think you already talking about women introduced a little bit about the issue that Damon will talk about because of exactly this role of women as caretaker of children. So now Damon will discuss, we'll focus on this topic, on the impact of drug policy on children.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Panizza, and to the Policy Centre for the New South for hosting us, and to the editors of the journal for giving myself and my co-author Diedrich Lohmann some space to talk about child rights within the special edition. It was a privilege to take part. It was great to hear Corina beginning the way she did, because there are some crossovers with what I want to say. Now we're talking about contributions to the special edition, and my article or chapter with Diedrich is actually on something quite narrow in the scheme of things. It's about the scheduling process in international drug control, which is the decision-making process about which substances should fall within the international drug control regime, which seems like a bit of a leap from child rights, but I'll hopefully show that it's not. It's quite an arcane diplomatic procedure in Vienna, not exactly the most exciting thing. So let me begin then with it fits in a broader context that I think I should begin with. And sometimes the basics are a good place to start. So I sometimes ask students a question that I think seems so simple that it can sound like a trick question, which is, what is drug control for? Right? And it usually stumps people for a few minutes, because the answer is actually obvious. The answer is this: global drug control and all of the efforts that go into it is a massive public health intervention to protect the population from addiction. That's basically it. That's the primary aim. We don't fight the drug trade to fight the drug trade. That's not what it's for. The drug trade is a problem because of concerns about health. So that's basically it. But over time, and it was a bit of a later addition to the aims of drug control, the protection of children came in. This was more an early 1970s kind of revelation, increasing into the late 1980s. And there we see the UN Drug Trafficking Convention mentioning children for the first time in the UN Drug Treaty framework for this. The drugs and the drug trade is referred to as a, quote, danger of incalculable gravity to children. And children in various policy documents in the UN system are referred to as, quote, our future, or our most precious asset. Now, leaving aside my distaste for referring to children as assets, I think what we have there, though, is at least a global consensus that the protection of children is central to global drug policy efforts. Now, in 1989, around the same time as the Drug Trafficking Convention was adopted, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted. And it included drugs within a child rights framework for the first time. Article 33 of that convention deals with drugs, and it's explicitly linked to the UN Drugs Conventions. Article 33 applies to drugs as defined by the relevant international treaties, which is the drugs treaties. And the same wording is included in ILO Convention 182, which Corina mentioned. This is the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor. So children involved in the production and trafficking of those substances defined in the drugs treaties are considered involved in a worst form of child labor. So we have a global consensus to protect children from drugs in multiple treaties, from drug control to transnational criminal law to child rights. So obviously children should be protected from drugs, which is the most self-evident thing we could say. I mean, it's obvious. Yeah, kids shouldn't do drugs and should be protected from the drug trade. No one would disagree with that. The question is, or the problem, at least as I see it, is that an overarching policy aimed to protect children can easily slip into blanket justification for whatever governments happen to be doing. So in international drug policy debates, we see the same commitment to protect children framing the same policies over and over again, as if without more, this aim can and does justify what's taking place. So just let me give you an example, a pretty egregious example based on the same treaties. The UN Drug Trafficking Convention has been used to defend the legality and the proportionality of the death penalty for drug offenses. Now, that doesn't seem like much of a surprise, but what's more interesting is that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is used to defend it as well. So I've been through all of state reports to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child since it began. And states that have the death penalty for drug offenses report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child that they use the death penalty to implement Article 33 of the Convention. And the same thing is reported to the Committee of Experts that oversees the ILO conventions. So in order to protect children from the drug trade, the death penalty is one of those tools. What that means is that states, by their reasoning, protect children through the stringency of their punishments. Now, that's not the only example. In all of those reports to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, I found references to urine testing, the denial of passports, crackdowns, drug raids. In one case, in the case of China, quote, all-out war on drugs, and very lengthy prison sentences. In some cases, already long sentences doubled if there's any evidence, and I don't know what the evidence is required for it, any evidence of the victimization of minors. Sentences can go from 20 to 35 years, from 10 to 20 years, and so on. Okay, so the range of what states report as being pursuant to their child rights obligations is basically as broad as the whole policy spectrum in drug control. So let me ask another question, and this one is a little bit more difficult. What are human rights for? I mean, it's a bit harder, that one, than what's drug control for. But I think it's safe to say that human rights are not there to blandly support whatever the government happens to be doing. Human rights regulate the relationship between individuals, groups, and the state, and they're a check on state power. They restrain in some ways and they direct in others. So yes, states have to do something to protect children from drugs. They have an international legal obligation to do that under multiple treaties, especially the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But what do they have to do? And what should they do? Child rights, and this comes to the title of my talk, child rights should serve as an accountability framework in drug control, not a justification for whatever states are doing. This is done by scrutinizing not only the aims of policies, but also the means adopted to achieve whatever goals are stated, paying close attention to those who are less visible, those who are marginalized, which comes to some of Corina's remarks, in fact. And with that in mind, child rights analysis and accountability doesn't happen in the abstract, which is what happens when you say children have a right to protection from drugs, therefore what I'm doing is justified. It has to happen in context on the specifics, using the tests and standards from within human rights law to help with that process. And that's how that slip from accountability to justification can be avoided. Now, lawyers often begin with definitions, so I should do the same. We can, again, this is coming back to basics. The child. Well, it's a human being below a certain age, which varies depending on country, but it's a quarter of the world population below the age of 18. It's a very diverse group of people. And we need to, what does protecting that group of people mean? We have to look at context. So I asked this question at the UN General Assembly special session on drugs. There was a panel on youth and women and marginalized groups and so on. And I simply asked, can any state tell me how it helps dependent children that their parent who has a problem with drugs gets a criminal record, right? How is that intervention in the best interests of the child? This relates very much to Corina's remark about incarceration. Now, it could be argued somehow that a parent gaining a criminal record is in the best interests of their children. I don't know how that could be argued, but it could. It could be said that a child's best interest in that situation is overridden by a societal need to have that sanction imposed. The point I'm trying to say is that in our typical drug policy debates, that child is less visible than a goal to protect the idea of the child, this broader category that's very, very diverse. They become visible in context. And we can look at the other end of the supply chain. Which children are affected by forced eradication efforts and other issues, and violence along the supply chain, for example, all in our effort to control drugs to protect children from this incalculable gravity? Is it of child rights significance that chemicals are sprayed on small holdings, or that a family's means of subsistence is uprooted? I think it is. And what would a child rights assessment say about those practices? Exploitation in the drug trade is clearly a child rights issue, but a key question is what amounts to exploitation? How do we define that, as opposed to, say, seasonal work on a family small holding, right? So which children are we talking about is the big question, I think, that needs a little bit more attention in global drug policy, and protecting them from what exactly? Now, absolutely central to a child rights approach is separating out, in terms of protecting them from what? We have to separate out drug harms from drug policy harms. This is basic stuff. And that's what accountability is all about. And after that long-winded introduction, this brings me to my article with Diedrich Lohmann about the scheduling system. It's all about policy, right? We focus on the process of placing substances under international control, which brings them into this legal framework I discussed, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child and ILO Convention 182. It's a very important process, even if it's monumentally boring. Right? It's a diplomatic process of people making decisions about substances based on boring documents, but it's central to the operation of the global drug control system. So the question we were posing is, what might be the child rights consequences of those decisions? And how can child rights be applied in a formal way that leans more towards accountability for those decisions? So we looked at two substances as an example of this. We looked at ketamine and we looked at cat, two quite different substances. Because they're both outside of the international drug control system now, but there have been discussions to bring both of them within it. So ketamine is on the WHO essential medicines list for children and for adults as well. It's one of the most widely used agents for anesthesia and analgesia in the world. But there's been pressure from some states to place ketamine under international control because of worries about recreational use. Now, while the International Narcotics Control Board, which oversees the drugs conventions, has favored bringing more substances into control, the World Health Organization has recommended against it, as have networks of medical professionals, for lots of reasons, but one of them being that there's already a gross lack of access to essential medicines, essential controlled medicines under this same system, including opiates such as morphine. And the worry was that bringing ketamine into it would limit existing access. So our argument, mine and Diedrich's, was that this would amount, in terms of pediatric access, to a limitation on the child's right to health. Even though it's with the aim of protecting children from, or young people from recreational use, it would be a limitation on the child's right to health if we pay attention to medical access. So the standards, the legal standards for limitations on human rights would have to be explicitly brought into any decision-making process at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs where these decisions are made. And the reason that's a novel perspective is because those rights considerations are not currently part of the decision-making process as a formality. States could bring them in as a matter of discretion, but it's not a formal requirement, nor is it formally required of the WHO committee that assesses medicines in this regard. So here, our argument was that human rights standard would necessarily bring, in this case, the child's right to health to the forefront, requiring public accountability within that commission for decisions taken. And in turn, we would hope that the children affected by those decisions become more visible in a process that tends to prioritize other outcomes. Now, cat, on the other hand, is a stimulant plant, many of us will know, with a long history of use, in particular in East Africa, Arabian Peninsula. It's a major export commodity for some countries. Its active components are actually already under international control, but unlike cannabis, coca, and opium poppy, the plant itself is not. Now, concerns about excessive use, in particular among men from diaspora communities in European countries, have emerged over the last number of years. And again, the International Narcotics Control Board has called for plants with psychoactive properties to be placed under control. It didn't name cat, but it was aimed at cat quite clearly. Some states have already banned the plant. The UK, rather infamously, basically wiped out the economy of a Kenyan town by doing so a few years ago. which demonstrates the economic effects. But I'd like to point out something quite specific that speaks to Corina's intervention. Once a substance is placed under international control, it immediately falls under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and ILO Convention 182. So that's because, as I mentioned earlier, those treaties refer to substances as defined by the relevant international treaties. So a decision by a small number of states in Vienna, a majority of the 53 members of the Commission, can change the obligations to all states parties to those other two treaties, which is unusual anyway, but that's the way the process would look. Now, there are many ways that children are involved in the cat industry, from picking, trimming, bundling, selling, bringing to market, and so on. And if there might be problems with that, right? All agricultural work can involve issues of child labor and harmful child work. But if cat were placed under international control, any and all involvement of children in its production and sale would become exploitation and a worst form of child labor, and states would have to put in place sanctions to prevent that under ILO Convention 182. So the issue here is that the decision in Vienna doesn't just bring new substances into the regime, it changes the legal status of a particular form of work that people under the age of 18 might be involved in. So using cat and ketamine as examples, our argument was actually kind of straightforward. We're saying if decisions to place substances under international control in Vienna engage the obligations of child rights treaties, which they do, then the obligations arising under those treaties should be borne in mind and states held to account for them when those decisions are taken. So we called for it to be formally brought into the process. And it's in this way, really, that accountability gets secured in context. And in this way that these arcane, even boring decision-making processes can be held more accountable. And I'm just out of time, but child rights is just one part of this. Obviously, there's a much wider corpus of human rights law to bring to bear. So let me just introduce everyone to the International Guidelines on Human Rights and Drug Policy, which we launched in 2019 with the support of the UN Development Programme, the Swiss government, and the Global Partnership for Drug Policies and Development. You can Google them, they're online, and you can search them for a wide range of human rights issues in global drug policy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Damon. So we have now our third speaker, who is Richard Chelin, who will go back to the gender dimension, what we saw that there are very close links between the gender dimension and child rights. And he will focus on the Mauritius, which starts with M like Mexico, but it's a very different country.
Thank you very much, Ugo. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it is a great pleasure to be part of this esteemed panel. Following up on Corina's and Damon's brilliant presentations, I think I have very little to add. But the key aspect that I will focus in this presentation is how policies at times do not reflect the reality on the ground. This might be the case of most policies, but this presentation will look at the drug policies in Mauritius. Before I begin this presentation or go into the meat of it, I would like to start off with a story, very similar to what Corina did. This story is about Mary. Not her real name. Mary and we were classmates in primary school. She was very smart, and her dream was always to be a social worker. Primarily because she didn't really know what social worker does or meant to do, but she had a broad idea and for her, it was a way to give back to the community where she grew up, and also in a way, give back to her country. Unfortunately, while I was in secondary school, my parents immigrated to South Africa, and we lost contact briefly, but kept in touch rarely on Facebook. 10 years later, I decided to visit my family in Mauritius to catch up, and I caught up with Mary. Mary was not a social worker. Instead, she was a single mother of two, trying to make ends meet. During the course of our conversation, she told me how just after high school, she started using drugs. And that took over her life, and she couldn't make it to university. The money that she was meant to save for university ended up, being used on drugs. And she also told me how, drugs took over her life. She met a fellow drug user, and also who happened to be a dealer. And together they had 3 kids. Her partner eventually got arrested for drug dealing charges and faced a maximum sentence. And her kids were taken away from her to be placed in the care of the state, as she was deemed an unfit mother. Shortly afterwards, she decided to go into rehab and decided that, she wanted to get her life back on track and make a change. She could see where she was heading. At the rehab center, she was treated very well. She was taught the skills that most, female users are taught, and she was on the right path, she believed. After leaving the center, unfortunately, she struggled to rehabilitate into society. She couldn't get a job. And she had to leave the place where she grew up, mostly because of the discrimination and the stigmatization that comes with a person who used drugs. The story of Mary is not unique, and it's not only common in Mauritius, but it's a story that can be felt around the world. There are many Marys, but however, Mary is a perfect example of how drug policies do not take into consideration the gendered aspect of users, and more specifically, women. When people hear of Mauritius, you have this conception of sunny beaches, tourist destination, clear water, etc., etc. It is indeed. It's a country that has often been hailed as a beacon of hope for other African states, primarily due to its economic boom in the late 1990s and its governance, where it appears on the Mo Ibrahim Index quite, in the top 2 on a yearly basis, and rightly so. On the Human Development Index, for instance, of 2019, Mauritius ranked 66 out of 189 countries. And between 1990 and 2019, Mauritius' HDI value increased by 28.8%. Also, in terms of gender equality, the island has made great strides. In education, for instance, female students now continue to dominate. Out of a student population of about 34,000 in the tertiary sector, 58.2% were female. The proportion of women in most senior positions in government services, such as chief executive, permanent secretary, manager, judges, directors, and magistrates, went on the rise, moved from 37 and 39%. And Mauritius was one of the 6 top reforming economies in terms of addressing discriminatory laws and regulations that limit women's equality of opportunity. The ministry in charge of gender in the country, for instance, constituted its gender cell committee in 2016 and came up with gender policy statement in 2017 as a framework that's still in place today for accountability and appropriate actions so as to contribute to the achievement of gender policy and women's empowerment. And needless to say that these achievements and successes are on an upward trend. However, this is just one reality. Underneath, there's another parallel reality, which quite a dark side to it. Mauritius has one of the highest prevalence of drug use per capita, with high rates of heroin injection being, in 2010, UNODC ranked it as top heroin use in East Africa and even on the continent. Also, the history of drug policy responses to the crisis over the years have been punitive against users and drug offenders in general. The Dangerous Drug Act of 2000 continues to this day to punish people caught for simply drug use with a maximum of 2 years imprisonment or a fine of about $1,640. As in other parts of the world, this measures, these punitive measures, have not led to a decrease in drug use. As a result, a number of negative consequences have emerged, in particular in terms of public health crisis, where in 2005, 92% of new HIV infections in Mauritius was among people who inject drugs. It was one of the biggest health crises to affect the country. I mean, this eventually constituted a wake-up call for government, who started responding to the health crisis through the introduction of harm reduction services around 2008. And prior to that, many civil society organizations and NGOs stepped on board and participated in that. Over the years, in 2013, the incidence rate of new HIV infection among people who inject drugs had dramatically fallen to around 44%. So there's been a dramatic decrease. And that was predominantly due to the change in tone and policies around harm reductions and more focusing on the human rights aspect of the drug user. So what are the gendered implications of drug policies? I mean, there is a general assumption in the literature that drug laws affect women predominantly as consumers. While this is true, there is also a significant lack of exploration of the impact of drug control on women involved in other sectors of the international drug market, such as production, trafficking, and consumption. While this is make for good research and further research practices, in this presentation, I will focus mostly on consumption and rehabilitation. Most of the female drug users in Mauritius are both infected with HIV and are victims of social isolation. I mean, very similar to what Corina said about the social isolation and stigmatization in her presentation. For those that manage to escape the situation, they are rejected by their peers and society, as the story of Mary indicates. Assistance in reintegrating in society is crucial for this marginalized aspect of the population. But often the drivers of consumption is driven or necessitated by poverty and social neglect. Unfortunately, these drivers are often overlooked and often worsened by contemporary drug policies that emphasize eradication and prohibition. And additionally, women who use drugs are sometimes characterized or labeled as the lowest of the low by both men and women involved in the drug trade. For instance, let's look at the rehabilitation aspect of the policy. While Mauritius has made great strides in this regard, the policy aimed at rehabilitation and reform do not take into consideration the gendered aspect of reality. I mean, if we just face it in general, policies are written in ink, meant to deal with a specific situation, ink on a piece of paper. While policies are always in 2D, in two-dimensional, with policymakers sitting around the table bringing information, most of the time, not every time. While these policies are often written in 2D, or two-dimensional piece of paper, the recipient of the policies do not live in a 2D reality. For instance, in Mauritius, the majority of patients of harm reduction practices are males as compared to women. Yet this has changed as we have seen more centers catering specifically for women only. In such centers, activities that help women who are on the way of rehabilitation, they help them and teach them skills to secure and acquire job skills and providing them support to start micro business in the local area. These women receive training to teach them on how to manage a budget and handle administrative processes and manufacture products and stuff like that. The other component of the project, however, also focused on educating women about their rights and the risk of domestic violence, drugs, and HIV. However, the ultimate aim of some of those NGOs is to restore the confidence and hope which these women would greatly need once they leave this center. But policies do not take these into consideration. From a policy perspective, specifically in Mauritius, everyone is treated as equal with a level playing ground. Men and women are equal, no doubt. However, as we are well aware, society is not equal. Patriarchal systems tend to favor a specific gender, which may be the recipient of less stigmatization, predominantly arising from the gender roles assigned in society. Like, women are meant to be mothers. Therefore, a woman who uses drug cannot be a fit mother. No matter whether she's cleaned, no matter she's been through rehab, no matter what happens, she will still be seen as an unfit mother. Inadvertently, in as much as policy aim to address positive issues, or as Damon said, to address health issues, policies to address health. But policy in itself inadvertently becomes a tool of oppression. And even more so, we see it in drug policies. And many of these women, the sad reality is many of these women who complete their training will not be able to find a job, or will have to confront stigmatization on a daily basis, as Mary does, or as Mary has experienced and still does. So what next? Obviously, the key factors that comes out is drug policies cannot be effective without addressing the root causes of structural inequality and discrimination which place women in a subordinate role in society, including in the family, often leading to experiences of violence, marginalization, and domination. Marginalization of women, poverty, gender-based violence, lack of job opportunities, and absence of social protection from the state, together with the need of support their family, especially if many women who use drugs do not have partners. If they are left to take care of their children on their own. And these often drive women back into the vicious circle of drug usage and going back to the drugs that they wanted to remove themselves from. Some recommendations that could be taken into consideration include, there's the need to conduct more research into the different ways in which women are affected or excluded from drug policies and the potential harms that current policies can have on them. There should be a promotion of drug policies and programs that are evidence-based, respectful of human rights principles, that are gender sensitive, and which emphasize health and social inclusion. Also, the governments and partners should encourage the participation of those directly affected by drug policies in the design and implementation of drug policies, especially in the gender aspect of it. In the field of drug consumption, for instance, government need to ensure that women who use drug can access gender-sensitive harm reduction and drug-dependence treatment services without fear of arrest or stigma and discrimination. And also initiative where former users can engage in economic activities without the fear of exclusion and stigmatization. While there are, it's currently being done. Government has started initiative to achieve that, but it's not where it's supposed to be, and there's still a long way to go. And unless these are taken into consideration or addressed, the Marys will continue to grow in the world, and it will be difficult to deal with the situation of Marys, and we'll find many more women falling within that vicious cycle. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So we have a few questions coming in. They must have to do with children, but I would like to ask a question to Corina and Richard, and I hope it's not an unfair question. If it's an unfair question, just tell me. I'm not an expert of this field, but listening to it, I was getting very, very sad, right? And what both of you mentioned, there are many. So you talked about two countries which are very different from each other, but face similar problems. And Corina said that the problems she described are common to many countries, but there are also some differences. Is there any country, and I know that your experience is specific to these two countries, but you are an expert of the field. Is there any country or any region who does relatively better from which we could learn and maybe, maybe not perfect, but which could point to a direction in which we could move?
Well, if I could begin, I would say as even sad as it could sound, that probably Western Europe is where we can find better practices. First of all, in terms of decriminalization, legally or de facto. I mean, you have less risks of being sent to jail if you're a drug user. So of course that reduces the impacts of criminalization on women and their families, because another aspect of that women who use drugs face, and men as well, of course, but is the risk, real or perceived, of having their children being taken away from them. So if you have that, the chances you will seek treatment, and then it's another matter if you find it, are of course lower. So I think that in countries where we find, and that's the case again of, I would say, Western European, where you don't have as many risks of being sent to jail if you're a user, where the risk of having your child taken away is actually implemented as a last resort, and you have a whole series of interventions before, where you have a prenatal and postpartum care and follow-up. So where all these programs are in place, you can have more chances of it being a drug user with a better care. And also your children will have less risks of being separated from their families and so on. I think there are some good interventions, for example, in Iceland with children with parents who use drugs. And that's also, of course, important for the families. In Italy, there are interesting programs for women who use drugs, and they can actually stay, at least in the case of San Patrignano, in the treatment centers, inpatient treatment centers with their children. Some interesting programs in Switzerland as well, and Norway. But again, practices that must be taken into account. But we cannot forget that the context, if we want to apply them to developing countries with a lack of general public health approach and public services for people who use drugs.
Richard, any?
I would agree with Corina. I think the best practices would obviously come from there. But also we have to look at it on what are the different aspects. Every country has some positive and some negative. For instance, in as much as Mauritius has prohibitive drug policies, but they also have very good harm reduction services with NGOs, mostly by the help of NGOs and not predominantly on the state. Most recently, you will see South Africa, for instance, have had going in the process of decriminalization of marijuana. So it depends on the various what key factors we're looking at, or what key aspects. Obviously, not every country can tick all the boxes or adapt to it. But in addition to Corina, I would say that if we look at the African Union policy on drugs or the plan of action, you'll see that they have a great change of direction and focusing more on harm reduction and various aspects. So I wouldn't add anything much to what Corina said. I would just say that in Africa, it would depend on what specific aspect you're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard and Corina. So there are a few questions which I think are more relevant for Damon, so I will ask them. But Corina and Richard, please feel free to jump in if you think you have something to say about this. So there is one which is general but very interesting, and so it says, the aim of the drug conventions is to protect the health and welfare of mankind, and it's not something which aims at which is contrary to human rights, but to the same time, breaches to human rights happen in the name of these drug law enforcement policies. And so what can be done to work towards human right-based drug control, if anything? I don't know, Damon, if you want to start, and if Richard and Corina are welcome to jump in.
Thanks. So the first thing I'd say there is the health and welfare of mankind. So just for those who don't know, that's just the first words of the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. I don't put too much stake in it, to be honest, because what matters are the obligations that states took on board to achieve that aim, whatever they might be. But we could try and hold those obligations to that broad aim and see if that's been achieved. I think the evidence suggests that it probably hasn't. But I think when looking at, there's a debate around whether the drug treaties themselves are somehow wholesale a violation of human rights. I think that's probably a stretch. It's probably not, but parts of them are an issue. The ban on indigenous and religious practices is probably an issue of itself for human rights at this point. Whereas there's other areas where the two treaty regimes have what I've tended to call tensions. And I think this is what the questioner was talking about, which is when states take what a pretty general obligation and that it poses human rights risks in implementing that. And I think the challenge there is to resolve those tensions in favor of human rights, but traditionally they've been resolved in favor of drug control, right? And then there's areas of complementarity where the complementarity could be strengthened. I think access to medicines is part of that, where there is at least an obligation within the drug control system to ensure access to medicines, but it's a bit incomplete. And I think the right to health can fill in the gaps there and ensure actual access on the ground to people as a legal standard. So I think unpacking that would be one step. Like we could take the drugs conventions, put them alongside human rights as we did in the guidelines on human rights and drug control, and start trying to unpack the obligations a little bit. I think that's one thing we can do. Get past the general idea that all drug control is somehow a violation of human rights and look at the specifics.
Richard, Corina, if you have anything to add or?
No, not on this. If possible, later I would like to intervene on the one on how do enforcement practices affect specific groups of children.
That was exactly the next question I wanted to ask. So there is a question that, as Corina has anticipated, is how supply reduction practices affect a group of children. So Corina, please go ahead.
Thank you. Very briefly, but a couple of years ago, I had the great honor of coordinating a research project in 8 Latin American countries on children, on the impacts of drug policy on children with parents incarcerated for drug offenses. So altogether, we interviewed 70 children and tens of people who are in prison, formerly incarcerated, and caregivers. I will write the name of the study of the project. No, but it's not, because this chat is for us, because I highly recommend it. I mean, I can say it because I only coordinated it and other 8 amazing teams did all the work, but it's called The Childhood That Matters. And I really recommend it because it looks at the impacts of incarceration on children, but with the crossing of drug policies. So, of course, the underlying basis is the effects of incarceration. We find many common points, but then the impact of drug policies has some specific nuances. For example, something that Damon mentioned, police raids. Detention often happens in the houses where children live with their families and where drugs are or are said to be. Detentions are extremely violent. Children face their properties being destroyed, their parents being beaten up, in some cases their mothers being raped, and themselves being pointed at with guns. So that violence is specific to drug policy related raids, and also the fact that it happens in the place where children live. As we already mentioned, prison sentences, the use of pretrial, of mandatory pretrial detention is another specific drug policies, supply measures related issue, which should be tackled through alternatives to incarceration, eliminating minimum sentences and the use of pretrial detention, and of course, again, decriminalization of drug use and drug possession. And some other aspects are stigma. Depending, of course, on the specific context, being part of a family where drugs are being sold, trafficked, and so on, can bring status, but it can bring further stigma. There's one of the children who said, they yelled at me from far away that I'm a trafficker, but she was very angry because she said, I'm not a trafficker, my family is, but I'm not. So they receive all this. And then another aspect, which is what we saw in the case of Gabby's son and all incarcerated women's children, is the fact that children's rights are not taken into account when giving a prison sentence. There's a fantastic example from South Africa, paradigmatic sentence from the South African Constitutional Court, in which an alternative to incarceration, it's not a drug policy issue, but of course it can be applied and should be applied, an alternative to incarceration is given to a woman who was in prison because of the impact that her incarceration had on her children. So the argument of the state is, I have the right to punish, but I do not have the right, by punishing her, to cause human rights violation or to undermine the situation of these children. So as a state, I cannot put them at risk because of my right to punish the mother. So I think that's something, it goes a bit with what, with this children rights assessment thing. And I think that sentence is quite interesting in that aspect. So again, there are other consequences, but of course I do not want to take too much time just to mention that we did a very interesting research on the impacts of COVID on women who grow poppy in Mexico. And so the interviews are with women, but of course the cascade effects are on the children. So also we have to take away the adult-centric lens, and always to bring children into the equation when we do research, because the effects of interdiction, eradication, confinement for COVID, everything has these other side effects that should be looked from the children rights and children concrete situations perspectives.
Yeah. So I guess, Damon, this question is also because the person who asked the question explicitly also mentioned crop eradication strategies, and I think it's very much linked to what you were talking about cat, right? Because in a sense, you were mentioning that the decision about cat would go all down the supply line and affects kid. I don't know if you want to add something on that.
Well, it's just, I think, to put this in, to come back to Corina's elements, I think just to cover all of the questioner's points. The first is that, again, this is about getting to specifics. We could look at the effects on children of general enforcement efforts. In other words, if our enforcement efforts increase societal violence, right, that's going to have an effect on children at societal level. If enforcement efforts are directed at parents or siblings, they might have an effect on other children, which at least has to be taken into account. And then there's enforcement against legal minors who are involved in criminal activity as well. So we can separate those out and look at those different aspects. With regard to crop eradication, I mean, it's pretty obvious. I mean, there's if it's chemical eradication, there's known health effects of that. It doesn't happen in very many countries, but where it does, especially in Colombia, it's widespread, and I believe it might be coming back soon. But even manual forced eradication can bring a lot of violence with it. And if it doesn't bring the violence with it, it can bring food insecurity and other problems that you might not see. I edited a book a number of years ago called Children of the Drug War. And one of the chapters was about how eradication efforts in Afghanistan could lead certain farmers into debt. And one of the means to pay off those debts is what are known as opium brides, right? And now it's much more than just drugs. Obviously, there's poverty issues and cultural issues and so on. And it's not my chapter, I didn't write it, but it's one of those potentially unforeseen and definitely unintended consequences of what can happen. So, and I think just making those things more visible has to be part of an accountability framework.
Very good. There is I want to make just a comment. I worked at the World Bank 25 years ago, and I was assigned Djibouti as a country. So I had never heard of CAT up to that point. And then when I had to work on Djibouti, I learned a lot about CAT. So there is a question. Richard, you want to add something to this or no? There is a question so does the criminalization of the drug market decrease or increase opportunities for the exploitation of children in the drug trade?
Yeah, can I answer that one? Because whoever posed this question either knows me or has read my work, because it's a funny question. So I posed that question, and I didn't mean it rhetorically. I posed it at the end of an article that I wrote in the Health and Human Rights Journal, or commentary. And the point I was trying to get at was this: under the Convention on the Rights of the, and it comes back to this question, is there a conflict between the drugs treaties and human rights in a way? Because under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, states have to take appropriate measures to protect children from involvement in the drug trade. And I just thought about that empirically. And I said, well, the measure that's been taken partially is to criminalize the drug trade, the whole supply chain. But if that increases opportunities for exploitation of children in the drug trade, if that whole strategy does that, you've got a comprehensive conflict between two ways of looking at the same problem. Now, that's a question that can be empirically tested. I'm not expert enough to do so. I think it needs economists, it needs other kinds of expertise. But my hypothesis is that it increases the opportunities for exploitation of children because companies are susceptible, and legal companies have exploited children, but they're susceptible to public attention to it. Criminal gangs aren't. And we see this whether it's in the UK with county lines policing and the drug trade there that's been very prominent, or you see it in relation to the involvement of children in violent drug gangs and so on, especially exploiting the minimum age of criminal responsibility because the costs are less if children get caught and so on. So my hypothesis is that criminalizing the supply chain increases the opportunities for exploiting children, but I'd really like to see an empirical study on it.
Okay, that's a good one. So we should give the word to Khalid, but Corina or Richard, if you have any last thing to add? No? Okay, so we are gonna have our concluding remark, which will, I think Khalid will start. So we're very happy to have Khalid Pinasti, who is the Executive Secretary of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, but even more importantly, one of the editors of this volume on drug policy and development. Khalid, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Panizza, and thank you very much to all the speakers here today. I think it was a wonderful opportunity for us to hear about this very, very key issues, and that are very important, of course, for our region and for the audiences of the Policy Center for the New South, and especially on gendered impacts in Northwest, Central Africa, and other places in Africa and the Arab world, and also, of course, on children and their rights. So thank you very much to the three panelists. I would really like to, just very briefly to close this event and this discussion we had, to thank very, very warmly the International Development Policy Journal. I think that it is always very important to remind that the open access providing it for researchers and to allow us to put out all this knowledge is really something that is exceptional in this current world, and we thank you very much for this opportunity. It is also, of course, to thank my colleagues, copy editors, Professor Julia Buxton and Dr. Mary Chineri Hesse from the University of Ghana, and of course, all the authors. We've been very, very lucky to get what I would consider the best in their domains, and we've seen Damon and Corina and other authors yesterday as well joining us, including Julia Buxton herself. So, and again, just to finish up these thank yous, I want you to thank again the center, the Policy Center, for providing us this great opportunity to really speak to this. Because usually all these debates are very much concentrated in high-income countries. And even when it is about a region, it's always in the research center in the north and speaking about what is going on in the south. And it's really having that opportunity and having this honor to bring in the latest research and really data and analysis and have it confronted with the empirical reality of what is ongoing in the New South or in the global South was an opportunity for us. So thank you very much. Just the takeaways from these two panels yesterday, because we've been speaking really about two key issues and what do we take out of them. It is really about how the international drug control regime has been confronted with major development objectives for our societies and for the international community, especially today. So we've seen the impacts and the confrontation, and unfortunately not going hand in hand or supporting each other, with peace building, with fighting corruption, with gender equality and equity. I mean, Richard and Corina has been talking to us about this and giving us very empirical real life examples. We've spoken about the impact on criminal justice, of course, today again, and on children and on youth, and this violent environment in which the children that are caught in this net find themselves. And so we were talking about our future, of course, and the future generations. So to see this from a perspective, because I think that everyone has, to some extent, an agreement into doing better and actually, really preserving people's rights, dignity, public health, their places in society, addressing stigma, addressing marginalization. And that is how we can ensure better security, peace building, better rights, equality for women and men, etc. So just to say that, again, as Damon said, we have to remember the roots of why the control, why this regime, this international regime was put there. It was put to fight the evil of addiction. I mean, we in Morocco read the conventions mostly in French and Arabic, and we speak of a fléau, but that is a terminology that is used in many, many, many other conventions, even the one against genocide, etc. Nevertheless, the word evil in English has only been used against international law against the addiction to illegal drugs. But nevertheless, the system was built also, how do you know what drugs to control or to put on those tables of control? It is based on the assessment of their addictiveness. Nevertheless, the system has left out alcohol and tobacco out of it because it was important commercially, culturally for the countries that were negotiating that system back in the 60s, and that were the hegemons of the world. So the other substances coming from other places, even with mild ceremonial religious use, have been rejected. And that is the system that has been built around the world for the last 60 years. So the results that we have is an increase because we have tools that do not respond to the empirical reality on the ground. We have an increase of consumption, of production, and of course of all the harms that go around, and trafficking, of course, money laundering, et cetera, et cetera. Now we find ourselves in a situation where, even if we can still call it unintended consequences, although they've been identified by the international community over 13 years ago, they're still unintended of the regime. So we see that the placements of budgets go in mostly into law enforcement and not to public health, for example, or other issues that could help out the geographic displacement, because we could put all the force on one place where there are the problems. The problems are just going to move to another place. That's what we call the balloon effect, like the air. You press one side and then the air goes to the other in the balloon. So you haven't gotten rid of that air. And the market itself, I mean, a $500 billion turnover market every year that is in the hand of criminals. They decide how to regulate it. They decide what substances to put on it and whom, et cetera, et cetera. So there is no control. It can add to that HIV because of the lack of harm reduction. Hopefully in Morocco, we have very good programs, including methadone substitution and needle and syringe programs. There is the issue of access to medicines and pain relief, because those are coming also from the same substances that could be used as drugs. And we let people die in pain because of the fear of them being addicted to prescribed medicines. Also, we have this incredible explosion of over-incarceration around the world. And we see that every issue that we have, we respond to it with incarceration. And it turns around again around the same populations, and that do end up in this situation. And we have, of course, huge issues around the world, according to even reaching, because the results are not there in terms of drug policy. Now we're even reaching the militarization of civil security in many countries, including in Central America. And finally, which is really problematic as well, is the rule of law and its application. Those laws are very far from the reality. So they're not implemented. Drug laws are always breached by populations, and that is not good for the law to be breached that easily, but it is about the law to adapt to reality than the contrary. And so this event really, for me, through these lenses of peace and gender, have shown that a public debate is key on these issues. There were certainties for a very long time, and now evidence and research is showing that those certainties need to be questioned. So on the debate to do better, there are two things that are very important to keep in hand, especially in our societies that are opening up this discussion now, and it's where it's nascent and where we can have this discussion. It is really to break the taboo and accept the positions of everyone as legitimate, as all the members of society, and accept that drugs have been there forever, and that the best that we can do is manage it at best and not think of elimination. That has been the goal that was followed up for many centuries without ever being reached in different societies in different forms, et cetera, of course. So what we need really is national debates and national consultations and discussions, and putting around the table stakeholders, and all of them. That means the police, that means judges and prosecutors, that means customs, academia, communities affected, that means people that consume, traditional farmers in countries where they are and where they also pay the prices, teachers, parents in the education sector, and religious leaders, for example, in societies like the Moroccan one, where it is key as well to have religious leaders in the debate. So it is about bringing together people and accepting that the points of views are always going to be different and finding consensus. And that is all, of course, all of the objective of this, and how it links to the special issue on drug policies and development, is to say that it is to somehow remove the barriers that current repressive drug policies pose in terms of achieving sustainable development for all of our societies. Again, thank you very much to everyone, and I've been very honored to be in this event yesterday and today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Khalid. We had somebody else from the Policy Center in the panel, but I guess it's not here, so. Oh, you're there. Sorry, I didn't see you. Please, go ahead.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to communicate to you the congratulations and the friendly greeting of Mr. Al-Inawi, the president of Policy Center for the New South. Then here we are. Thank you to your efforts at the end of this fruitful meeting. Yesterday and today, panelists dealt with a topic that governments and their public policy must address. They must address it to protect and help their population, especially here, children and women. Khalid had already resumed and listed in the best manner and the best way we can imagine your relevant thoughts on the subject. But as a former security responsible in Morocco, I want to say that I'm entirely agree that security-only approach is not able to deliver effective results in the fight against drugs. And that coercive drugs policies have shown limits and can hamper peace-building process and development. I believe your thoughts, proposals, and suggestions will certainly constitute a great contribution to enhance public policies dealing with drug issues. Finally, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to prize our collaboration with the DevPol. We will seek to strengthen it in the future, and we remain open to any proposal in this direction. Thank you.